Another Atypical Philosopher video. Today I'm going to talk politics with regard to religiosity and in the context of the US. The US is in the midst of a pretty interesting political battle at the moment between Biden and the Democrats and Trump and the Republicans, with old school Republicans caught in the middle and independents pretty much not being given an option this election cycle. And I think the stats are on a 2-to-1 basis opting for the Democrats. And the polls are very interesting because realistically it looks like Biden is going to win. And then Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away sadly, and this has left everyone all of a flutter. For understandable reasons, and this could play into the hands of Trump's Republican support in motivating them to come out and vote, or if the nomination goes through before the election, actually there could be a reaction and you might see more Democrats getting out to vote and motivated and mobilized. So I think there's going to be a lot of interesting ramifications to the sad passing of Ginsburg. It's also an interesting time for the non-religious because, well, actually, to go back to the polls really do favour Biden. People don't like to think so because they go back to 2016 and think the polls were wrong, but the polls weren't really wrong. Maybe wrong in one state in undercounting certain demographics, arguably maybe 4 states overall, but really one state, and that kind of swung it. But they were perfectly accurate in the national votes proportions, which Hillary won by a couple of million. And interestingly, I saw one analysis yesterday that looked at what would happen in the case of the polls being wrong to the same extent they were on the last cycle, and Biden romped to victory still. So I think it's quite interesting. I think there's a lot of media reporting that might make you think it's closer than it really is, because that's what sells news stories, right? But I think realistically Trump's up against it to get voted in, and that's obviously fantastic from my position. And I hope it stays that way. There are a couple of important states such as Florida, but even Florida is not essential to Biden. So I don't know. We'll see how it goes. But what's interesting is where the non-religious sit in this. Non-religious voters overwhelmingly favour the Democrats historically and going forward. That still looks to be the case. But to some degree, with Joe Biden at the convention pulling on his Catholicity, his Catholic identity, I think the non-religious are being forgotten because they're being taken for granted. And you can understand why this is the case, because in America, if you pander to the non-religious, you are going to lose probably some middle ground, possibly middle conservative voters who might be interested in voting for Biden because they are not happy with Trump. But if you start pandering to the non-religious, you might lose them and you will invigorate the right. And so, given that the non-religious are probably likely to vote for the Democrats no matter what, you can almost forget them. And I think this is actually what's happened. And there was a really interesting 538 article that I'll link below. But I'll quote it now. Actually, Here's the quote. Democrats are once again doubling down on religion this year. Faith was on full display during the Democratic National Convention, where Joe Biden closed out the week with several pointed references to his Catholic faith, as I said before. And the Biden campaign is also making an ambitious play for white evangelical Protestants and Mormons, 2 loyal Republican groups where Democrats hope to make some inroads. Let me interrupt there, because what's interesting is the stats point towards Democrats making huge inroads with white voters. Trump has actually lost an awful lot of white voters right across the board, across the states this election, and that is hugely important because traditionally the Republicans have relied on WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant voters, to carry them through the elections, and the fewer people that vote, the better the Republicans do. The more people that vote, the better the Democrats do, and that's why Democrats concentrate on grassroots mobilization, and Republicans worry about gerrymandering the districts, voter suppression, and disenfranchisement. So, they want fewer people to vote, so they go around, with their machinations, trying to make it that fewer people can vote or want to vote. So that's what's happened, and it's interesting that they have lost some of the white vote that they rely on. So back to the 538 article. Often lost in this, though, is the fact that Democrats are mostly ignoring a massive group of voters who are becoming an increasingly crucial part of their base, people who don't have any religion at all. Right now, voters with no religious affiliation look like they might back Biden in record numbers. According to a poll conducted by the Pew Research Center in early August, 72% of non-religious voters, a group that includes people who identify as atheists, agnostics, and nothing in particular, are planning to support Biden. That's a 4 percentage points higher than the 68% who supported Clinton in 2016. And that's a big deal because despite being frequently overlooked, non-religious people make up a sizable part of the electorate. An analysis of validated voters by Pew found that religiously unaffiliated voters accounted for 1/4 of the electorate in 2016 and 30% in 2018. So back to me, wow, the non-religious voters are a huge portion of the electorate, and ostensibly the Republicans are going to write them off completely because they're in bed with the evangelical right. Then actually they've lost 30% of the electorate straight away. Whoa, that's very interesting. So it's quite hard to be a sort of fiscal conservative atheist these days, I think, given all the other stuff that Trump is trying to push through and to appeal to. So back to the article. The unaffiliated are a key demographic for Democratic candidates in particular. More than 1/3 of the people who voted for Clinton in 2016 were religiously unaffiliated, making them just as electorally important to Democrats as white evangelical Protestants are for Republicans. Yet despite constantly hearing about the importance of white evangelical voters in an election cycle, Democratic politicians have been slow to embrace a growing number of non-religious people who vote for them. Why? In the past, the challenges of organising the religiously unaffiliated have made it easy to understand why Democrats haven't made a real effort to appeal to them more. As most don't regularly gather like a church congregation, religiously unaffiliated Americans can be difficult to reach. A lack of institutional leadership also means there aren't many prominent people or groups showing up to nudge politicians to pay attention to their issues. As an aside, it's like herding cats. Trying to unify atheists under one sort of banner or under one leader. Back to the article. And despite rising tolerance for atheists and non-religious people in American culture, overt appeals to the non-religious still run the risk of turning off the majority of voters who are people of faith. Back to me, and that's what I was saying earlier. And to the article again. But there are signs that antipathy toward President Trump has mobilised some religiously unaffiliated voters in unprecedented ways. Although Trump is not an overtly pious figure, he's embraced a vision of American culture that privileges Christian identity and heritage. That's a view that most non-religious Americans reject, which is likely to be part of a reason that their support for Biden is so high, despite the campaign's minimal outreach efforts. In the coming years, though, that calculus might have to change, since a growing size of the country's non-religious population could make these voters more difficult for Democrats to ignore. So back to me, that is really interesting. The article goes on and on, very, very interesting, and it talks about the share of the non-religious proportion growing. Okay, so as they get older, because they're predominantly young at the moment, or the younger generations, as they get older people are more likely to vote. So the non-religious electorate will grow in importance and power because they will have a higher voting statistic than previously. In fact, previously people have thought that non-religious don't vote very much. They have a low turnout, but actually that is changing, and they are voting just as much as the religiously affiliated at the moment. And whilst that is happening, obviously as the non-religious group grows, the religious group gets smaller. Certainly as a proportion, but also in real terms, people are leaving religion. And here's the important part: they're not going back. So generally, when people leave religion, statistics show they do not return to a religion. And so this group is only becoming more and more important in American politics. And arguably going forward, where they can be ignored now because they're in the bag for the Democrats, I think going forward, both the Republicans and the Democrats will start fighting over this group, because the Republicans will end up needing them, just in the same way that the Republicans will need non-white voters. They have relied on the white electorate for so long, and that group is diminishing in power, that they, for their long-term success and sustenance and existence, they will need to appeal to non-white voters. And so they are going to have to change, whether you like it or not. You've long heard the kind of, this will be the death knell for the Republicans, and they're just hanging on. Again, they're still hanging on. Trump is still getting in the low 40s sort of support, and that is amazing considering all he's done. I mean, literally the guy could have shot someone on Fifth Avenue and people would still vote for him. It's insane. So I think this is a really interesting demographic shift towards the Democrats, on the back of it being a shift in the electorate away from religion, and with immigration away from the power of the white voter. And we've seen this in, as I said earlier, the ruby red states are starting to see some serious points move towards the Democrats. Now, they'll still vote for Trump and the Republicans overall, but the shift in those stats is quite remarkable. And the problem that Trump has had is that he has not attracted more voters than he had in 2016. He just got in 2016, lost the popular vote. So in order to make sure he gets in this time around, he's got to attract more people than he attracted before. Otherwise, he's in trouble. And simply put, he hasn't done that. He's annoyed. He's annoyed people. More people have left support for him than he has gained, and that's not healthy for his future as an incumbent president being voted back in. There you go. Religious voters might not like this, but this is the truth, and you've got to kind of deal with these statistics as their bloc becomes less important and the non-religious bloc becomes more important, and continues to grow in being mobilised. So getting out there and voting. I mean, there are some angry non-religious voters, I can tell you, because I've spoken to a lot of them online. And yeah, I'm British, I'm not American. What right do I have to comment on this? Well, I've followed American politics for an awful long time now. Most of my blog readers are American, and so actually I spend more time learning about American politics and following American politics than I do with British politics these days. And it is a time of change, and it's certainly interesting. And I think the growing anger and energy, and that's a term that's used in the 538 article, that the non-religious are showing for voting, will prove important in these changing demographics, at least this election cycle. So the challenge is to appeal to them going forward, and the added layer of challenge is that very often the non-religious are a bit more progressive than your sort of corporate Democrats of the past, and this has been a challenge for the Democrats for 5 years. Okay, this is a problem with Clinton, Bernie Sanders. This election, although people are getting behind Biden in their sheer hatred of Trump, the Democrats will need to change in trying to adapt to and adopt the progressive viewpoints. and outlooks of a lot of their voters. That's going to be a challenge, and it'll be interesting to see how the Democratic Party changes over the next 4 years, whether they win or not. So there you go, something different today. Comments down below. Please visit my blog, buy some merch, buy all my books. You don't have to read them, just buy them. In fact, buy 10 of them. And until next time.